Good afternoon. So they asked me to talk about monitoring and tracking DFC compliance. And so I thought, because these seminars generally have a broad spectrum of folks, maybe a new board member or maybe a very experienced attorney and general manager. I'm kind of covering the spectrum here, so that'll be another excuse I'll use if some of you really experienced people go to sleep, because you've heard all this before. But I want to make sure that we don't skip over too many things for the new folks, so I'm covering some pretty basic stuff. Monitoring and tracking DFC compliance, I think, let's start with some definitions. A desired future conditions is from Chapter 36. Means a quantitative description adopted in accordance with Section 36.108 of the desired condition of the groundwater resources in a management area at one or more specified future times. So most folks in the room are probably really familiar with that. And so you probably also know that there's a pretty standard set of metrics that are used for looking at desired future conditions. The top three are the most popular: water level declines over a period of time, the volume remaining in an aquifer over a period, available drawdown remaining in an aquifer over time. And then there's the spring discharge, water quality. A couple of districts have subsidence metrics now, desired future conditions. And so most of my discussion will be about the top three. The bottom three are a little more specific in nature, and the vast majority of the state is dealing with the top three and trying to figure out how to monitor and track and make sure that they are compliant. So let's look a little bit more. First of all, I'm not a lawyer, and there's a lot of lawyers in the room, so this is not legal advice. But when you go and look at Chapter 36 and try to say, what does compliance really mean? It has a small section in there, and an affected person may file a petition with the commission, the TCEQ, requesting an inquiry for any of the following reasons. And I went through and selected the ones that I think are really more pertinent to complying with DFCs. A district fails to update its rules to implement the applicable DFC. That one's pretty simple. Rules adopted by the district are not designed to achieve the adopted desired future conditions, or the groundwater in a management area is not adequately protected due to the failure of the district to enforce substantial compliance with its rules. And its rules would presumably have something about the DFC, and its management plan would have DFCs and MAGs and a discussion of all of that and how they're going to achieve those. And so this was the starting place for me in regards to, kind of setting up the talk. There's no cookie cutter way to track DFCs and ensure compliance, but there's some concepts that I wanted to cover today that try to assess where you might want to what you might want to prepare for in regards to, if you're a district, in regards to your defense of these things and saying, we are doing a good job on this, or to play the devil's advocate and say, well, who would want to say that we're not doing a good job as a district? And so these are the things I think we can start with. Maybe a little vague, and of course in the Q&A we can ask some lawyers what they think about that and go from there. So a little history I think is also good for looking at DFCs. Back in 2000, the first GAM was put out on the street, the Water Development Board. It was the first of many GAMs, and so the reason I talk about that is because we're doing a lot of DFC evaluations with GAMs. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if we go back to 2000, that was the first one. And in 2002, many of y'all remember Senate Bill 1 if you've been around for a while. And that was the first bottoms-up plan for the state water plan. And all the regional water planning groups got started, and they did their thing. And what happened was the regional water planning groups didn't have really an availability number. So they did their best and scurried around quickly and said, what the heck is groundwater availability? and they came up with all kinds of methods to determine groundwater availability. And so by 2005, there was new legislation, and that's when desired future conditions came in. And that's when we came up with, at the time, managed available groundwater. Since then, it's been changed to modeled available groundwater. But that was the first initiation of this whole concept of desired future conditions. And then by 2010, the first modeled available groundwater numbers were available for the regional water planning groups, and that's what kind of constrains what they do with the regional water planning and what they can use and what's available for groundwater if you want a recommended strategy in the plan. So by 2022, we just finished the third round of DFCs and MAGs, and like I said, some of y'all are very much familiar with that, and some of you it may be new. But almost all of those DFCs are evaluated with the use of GAMs. If the GAMs are available, they're usually used as a tool to evaluate DFCs and do high pumping runs versus low pumping runs and everything in between, and look at impacts to all these other things. And so compliance, presumably, is generally evaluated with real aquifer conditions. And so while we pay a lot of attention in the DFC and the joint planning process to what the model is saying and where we're heading, the actual compliance of a lot of those DFCs is going to be assessed through aquifer monitoring data. So monitoring considerations, this is a cross-section through North Texas GCD of the Northern Trinity Woodbine aquifer, and you can see lots of different complexities there with the productive units and non-productive units. And so some of the monitoring considerations as you start to look at a monitoring plan and then building a program of long-term monitoring so you can track DFCs. Some of those things that come into play are, aquifers, and whether you want to lump those aquifers together or whether you want to split them. And this is pretty generic stuff here, but essentially, a lot of times the GAMs that are used to drive the DFC evaluation and maybe setting the DFCs, maybe they lump or maybe they split in a certain way that gets kind of built into your DFC and your DFC statement. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So that's a consideration. And of course, aquifers, whether they're confined or unconfined, whether you're in the outcrop or the down dip zone. I know Upper Trinity and the western flank of the northern Trinity aquifer. They look at outcrop and down dip differently. Some other GCDs have also considered that. I'm not sure where all that's implemented, but all of those things matter, and it's all can be generally aquifer and locally specific to your needs, to the drivers that you think are important to managing groundwater. And so even geographically, are you gonna look at DFCs from a regional basis, from a district basis, on a county basis? If you're a multi-county district, obviously, maybe you want to look across the whole district, or there's different considerations in regard to how you're going to set those DFCs, make those statements, and adopt those statements. Because once you adopt the statements, then that's what you're going to be complying with according to Chapter 36. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just reading it. The access and ability and the cost of monitoring. Now, some of these restrictions or considerations don't really have the same impact across the state. You may be in a part of the state and you may have a district that you can get access to a lot of wells and it's not a problem. In other parts of the state, access to good wells and your ability to monitor those and make sure that you're going to be able to monitor them long term is a huge deal, and it's a tough challenge. The frequency of measurement is a consideration, whether you're going to do that annually or more frequently, less frequently, and of course other things that matter in regards to making a DFC statement and then trying to comply with that statement, or the starting time for that DFC. A lot of times that starting time for the DFC might be consistent with a GAM run or the GAM runs that were done and the well files that were turned over to the Water Development Board, or they may not be. But it's important to consider that because if you don't have data at that starting point, then you're all of a sudden perhaps in a bit of a quandary when someone else starts asking you, how are you doing on compliance? So something to think about. Some potential monitoring challenges, and again, some of these we're already covering, but sufficient monitoring locations in each aquifer, geographically, vertically. Do you have good well distribution? And again, there's no magic cookie cutter silver bullet answer for any of these things. That's why I started with the Chapter 36 language about that's a little vague about how you can be challenged on this, because you need to be thinking through and get the right people thinking about it from a legal, hydrogeologic perspective and probably political perspective with regard to what is really necessary and relevant. And so I'm just trying to list some of these things for you to consider, because there's no cookie cutter answer on any of these things. Negotiating access agreement can be very challenging, especially in today's environment. Identifying screen intervals and wells. Obviously, there are techniques to do that, but it costs money. You have to get access. You're going into somebody else's well, and there's a lot of older wells that you just don't know exactly where those screens are, or where they're open hole, and what you're actually monitoring. And so, how could that be challenged in the future? How are you actually doing on complying with whatever stated DFC you have? A lot of those wells are screened across multiple aquifers. And if you've got a DFC statement that says, in this particular aquifer, we're going to have X amount of drawdown, that may be an issue. Collecting consistent measurements. One thing we know, if you look at, water level responses after you turn a big pumping well off, you might have 50 or 100 foot of water level increase over time. And if you're measuring that well 1 month or 1 year after you've turned that pump off for an hour, and then next year you measure it after 24 hours of downtime, then that's going to matter in what kind of data you get and how that is going to affect your overall monitoring and where you think you are in compliance. Cost to install appropriate wells. Sometimes new monitoring wells are not that big of a deal and not that expensive, and it's a part of the flow of budget for a GCD. In some other areas, it's a big deal to spend $500,000 on a good monitoring well. And so those things can be hindrances to, monitoring the aquifer potentially as your DFC statement or the GAM has averaged a water level decline or a percent, available drawdown or whatever that might be. And so those things are there to consider as you move forward and try to improve your monitoring program. Incorporating changes to the monitoring network over time and how those new measurements, new wells, new data are going to impact your numbers and where you think you're tracking. And maintaining monitoring wells for long periods, of course, is always a challenge. So if we look a little bit at tracking DFCs, we'll start with some examples. And again, I'm not going through a full process here of trying to figure out or state this is the way this is done. I'm just kind of going through and providing some input or some ideas and challenges for you to think about. So if we go to the Ogallala, I didn't mark this, but I think it's Dahlem County. Anybody spot a trend there? Okay, so we could probably give this to most folks, and they could figure out the trend. And this is the easy one. I started with the easy one. That's the Ogallala. That's great. And I'm not saying there aren't some complicated issues in the Ogallala. I'm saying in this particular well and potentially wells around it, maybe it's an easier thing to spot a trend and say, hey, we are complying with our DFC or not. So, and if we go to the Hickory, this is a well south of Brady, and in the Hickory Aquifer, McCulloch County. You can see, a couple of things in this hydrograph. And again, these are single wells across a larger county or district or GMA, however you want to define that DFC. But they help to highlight some of the issues that as you're tracking compliance, and whatever you envision that to be, and whatever hurdle you think you need to get over to make sure you're complying. These individual hydrographs, I think, help us to highlight some of the issues that are there. Number one, on this one, you can see, it's generally pretty flat for the most part, but you can see a kind of a change in some kind of a water level decline, somewhat seasonal there in the early years, maybe the first 10 or 12 years, and then it's actually the water level kind of rises a little bit, and now in the last few years it seems to be falling. And again, if you're looking at DFCs, and my take on DFCs, given the way that they've been set up and generally used, is that they're long term and they're more regional. And so if you're folding in individual hydrographs into a larger analysis for a county or district or GMA, then all of these things matter when you start to look at how any particular issue or problem can affect those data and how you're complying. So Pecos County, this is an actual municipal water well, I think for the town of Wink. And I just pulled these off the Water Development Board website again, and obviously you can see that there's a seasonal impact from pumping in this well. You can also see that it looks like it's pretty stable for the most part. It's dropping off here toward the end. And so again, it's just to point out, none of this is rocket science, it's to point out the difficulty potentially in all of this data and all of the issues that can affect how you're doing your calculations and what you're thinking about your compliance. Here's a really interesting. This one is in North Bexar County, and we basically have, if you look at the DFC for the Hill Country, it's 30 feet of drawdown in the Trinity out to 2060. When you look at this well, it goes from 200 feet in 2012 down to 350, back up to almost 150, and then back down. What you may not know about this well, it's even though it's a Trinity well, it's karst Trinity, and it acts more like an Edwards well. And you've got the Cibolo Creek that pours water into the Trinity aquifer in that area up to 80,000 or even more, 80,000 acre feet a year, not too far from some of these wells. And so even though we have an aquifer that generally is a little more stable, there's parts of these aquifers that can act very differently. And so that affects, when you contemplate a 30-foot DFC and you see these kind of responses in the aquifer, I'll let you think about that. Hayes County, same way. Here we're seeing some large fluctuations. This is not as big as in North Bexar County, northern part of San Antonio, but you're seeing quite a bit of fluctuation. This is the Middle Trinity aquifer, and it's gonna be impacted by recharge and wet seasons, and so you're gonna see that in the response in the water levels. And so all of these things, again, there's no silver bullet answer. That's why you need to think carefully and get good input on how to make your calculations, how to think through how you're complying and tracking. The other thing to note here is, you can have some pretty long dry seasons in some of these aquifers, and then finally get some wet seasons and some response and recharge, and you can get some pretty big hits that change the picture. This has been going on for eons in some of these aquifers. So, in one way, I told Ron I was going to use one of his spreadsheets in the talk. So, Ron, if I say anything wrong, correct me. But Blanco County, basically, this is one of the, if you get down to the nuts and bolts of how you take all your wells in a county and track them through time and average them and try to look at DFC compliance, this is their spreadsheet. Starting in 2008 with a baseline year and the water levels there. And, Ron and his staff have basically been out measuring water levels and pretty simple stuff, right? For the most part, And yet, at the same time, when you start to look at the distribution of wells across a county, and then there's different ways. Do you just do a straight average like is done in this spreadsheet, or do you do a gridding method where you get sort of a equal contouring or gridding of data, and then that would be more like a GAM, but I don't know if that's really representative. And again, you just need to ask yourself the hard questions about how your approach and your science and your data can be challenged, because that's really what's there in chapter 36 with regard to, how you could be challenged. Carrizo, just moving through some more hydrographs here. Obviously, this well going back to 2004. Overall, the trend looks pretty flat. Not a whole lot of big movements. You can see a lot more activity right around this well, whether it's a pumping well or close to a pumping well. And then after 2016, you see a little bit lighter response. Again, back to the point on this well. What exactly is impacting those wells, and does that change over a long period of time? In some wells, you can be monitoring them for several years, or 10, 15 years, and go, that's one of the cornerstone wells of our system, and then somebody else puts in a big production well not too far away, and that impacts what you thought was a good steady well. Now, that may be representative of what's going on and fold into a larger average so you can track and comply, or you may have to reconsider. Again, no silver bullet answers, although those things you just need to consider as you move forward. Woodbine well in Ellis County, nothing really interesting to say here so much, more than, the gray zones there are missing data. And missing data is a real thing for a lot of wells. So, Trinity, Erath County, again, just looking at, water levels down at 205, then they trend back up, and now they're going back down. And, that's different than that Ogallala, flat line curve we saw earlier. And so all of these things, again, hopefully your monitoring system is robust enough and your tracking approach is robust enough that you can say reasonably well, I'm complying because I'm tracking and I'm on track to do this. And then the other, and it takes into account the fact that this well may be different than all the other wells in your monitoring network, and you just need to consider how effective and how representative is the data and what I'm presenting. So some of those potential tracking challenges, just to kind of wrap up here. Pumping and seasonal impacts, important to consider availability and reliability of the data at the starting time of when you're supposed to be tracking and enforcing complying with the DFC. If you happen to have a bunch of wells that you're starting to monitor in 2018, but your DFC is set to start in 2010, you're either left with sort of backtracking, well, what do I think the water level was at that point in 2010, or, maybe resetting the clock a little bit on some of the monitoring. Changes in use of a monitoring well, whether it's close to a pumping center or not, collecting consistent measurements, downtimes on pumps, important, especially if you're taking water levels from pumping wells so that, have equipment in them, and pumps in them, and incorporating changes in monitoring network, monitoring wells over long periods. All of these are the normal tracking challenges that will need to be considered when you're trying to come up with a good plan. Those long-term patterns, depending on the aquifer, obviously this is not the case in all aquifers, but those long-term patterns of recharge, wet seasons, that makes a difference, and it can certainly change the path you're on, and that's something you need to be aware of. And again, no silver bullet answers, just something to think about. Aquifer demands in some of the areas in West Texas, we know we're seeing impacts, and I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to leave for questions here shortly. In some of these areas where you've got big oil and gas production, and you've got fracking demands, and those things are going to affect these trends and tracking and compliance potentially. Commodity prices, we've seen that over the decades when it comes to irrigation, and so those things probably need to be considered. Other interesting debates, and I don't have any answers here either. Robert Mace is here. He knows the answer to all these questions, by the way, he tells me. And obviously, there's some really, I bring that up because we've already talked about this in another seminar, and Robert and I had to talk about it. But bottom line is, there's really smart people on both sides on all sides of these questions, and they answer them differently. And so, is joint planning planning or is it regulatory? And so I guess the answer is yes. And then the question is, as you drill down on that question, moving the goalpost. I hear a lot about that, like moving the goalpost. That's when are we going to stop moving the goalpost with our modeling and with our starting times and restarting the clock? Another way to say that. And I guess my question to those questions is, are we gonna use adaptive management? And there are certain things I think that districts don't have control over, and those 9 considerations in considering a DFC, those considerations are outside the district's control in many cases. I mean, who knew California was coming to Texas, right? Who knew? Who knew Tesla was coming to Austin? So bottom line is, those things, speak to adaptive management, best available science. If we're improving the science, then I'm not sure why we couldn't move the goalpost. I don't know. Just things to think about. Weighting factors and local control. I think as you go across the state, obviously weighting of these different 9 factors is different in different places. And I think that if you were to read chapter 36 and say if local control is kind of the approach, then that's sort of wrapped up into that, I think. But that's just my opinion. Timing of enforcement, and if you attorneys can fight over this, I guess, but if you have a DFC that has a statement about 2070, then can you enforce something at 2030 or 2040? I don't know. Mitigation of impacts, of course, that's a big topic these days with a lot more areas that are experiencing some drawdown. So that's other things to think about in the broader DFC debate outside of compliance. But that is it.